We are fortunate to have Richard Baker, the President and CEO of the Managed Funds Association, here to kick off the conference. Prior to being CEO of the Managed Funds Association, Mr. Baker served several terms in Congress. He was a member of the House Financial Services Committee and chairman of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets for 12 years. So I expect we have a lot to learn from him.
Good afternoon, and thank you. I have not missed the irony of a South Louisiana guy who used to be a congressman speaking to a group of academics and regulators. Just somewhere in there just seems to be a little bit of a mismatch, and I just figured I might get that out there. Also, I used to make this speech when campaigning back home, and particularly proud of it toward the latter part of my career. I served 22 years in the Congress, to say that I am running for re-election after 22 years of dedicated service. I'm making all this up, and without an indictment. And that may not sound like a whole big deal to you, but in Louisiana, let me tell you, that was top drawer. So you then begin to question yourself, why or how did this guy get to be associated with the Managed Funds Association, which is the voice for the single manager hedge fund industry and our stakeholders? It really goes back to 1998, the failings of LTCM and the President's Working Group in '99 issuing a report in which they recommended several steps of transparency to enhance communication between the industry and the regulators. I took that report and turned it into the Hedge Fund Transparency Act of '99, held a hearing in my committee, and many of the folks who were in business then, who are still in business now, and members of MFA, appeared before my committee hearing and expressed the view that the bill was pretty stupid and they weren't sure about me either. So that's how I first came to know most of the people for whom I now work. Over the years, my understandings of the role of the industry developed, and the appreciation for the significance of their contributions in an economic sense became more importantly framed, and the board engaged me in 2008 to begin a very practical transition. I don't know the extent to which any of you in your professional capacity have had experience with MFA over the years, but as originally instituted and ordered, it was really more of a deflective enterprise. Most of the participants in the early days of the industry were not real keen on talking to the press or going to the Hill, or certainly not being asked to come forward and visit with regulators, and a very private interaction methodology. But the board about 2008 began to realize that that was not a sustainable model. And I was asked to help build a different MFA, to begin outreach in a responsible manner to the Hill, and to hopefully develop over time a trust relationship with the regulatory world. One of my first interactions when my constitutional rights were restored. You may not know that when you leave Congress and you're engaged in a lobbying activity, you can't speak to a member of Congress about anything, or a staffer. So I would take very long detours around the Capitol complex at night going home to make sure no one could take a photograph of Baker going in the Capitol. But when I could go back, I went to see some of those folks with whom I felt I had the best relationship, gave this gentleman my card. He said, "Managed funds, so what's that?" And I said, "We represent primarily single manager hedge fund world and those with whom we do business and are engaged." And he says, "What's a single manager hedge fund?" So it was a rather slow and tedious conversation, but my goal in getting to that point was, in the current news coverage of the day, was discussions about complications with and concerns over credit default swaps. And so I carefully eased my way into that end of the corral and said, I would love to engage and speak for a moment about concerns others may have about the credit default swap market. Would that be of interest to you? He put my card back down on his desk, leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and I won't tell you exactly how he phrased it, but he said, "They don't pay me enough money to understand that." Now, that captures the communication problem that our industry has with the Hill. In fact, we did an extensive survey, and we didn't just try to get members or staff. We went to union presidents, university presidents. We would call them in our world the opinion leaders, the people around whom journalists would turn to and ask opinion. I knew it was bad, but I really didn't have an understanding of the depth of how bad. If I had to characterize the summation for you succinctly, we are New York, we are manipulative, we are secretive, and we're profitable. Now, if I could pick 4 words and tell you that I would not want you to go to the Hill and have them stuck as your label, that would be it. And the most ironic thing about the detailed analysis was the more financially literate the people who were surveyed described themselves. People who would watch CNBC, read the Wall Street Journal, they thought worse of us than the average working man. And so it spoke to the point of the need to go back and do press analysis and the words hedge fund and then the words attributed to that primary goal as being descriptors of hedge fund. And you found repetitively highly leveraged, highly risky, highly profitable, all of the things which would cause anyone who had no reason to understand the role of the industry to have very negative and reinforced negative opinion. And so we began to understand, even at the retail level, how big the task ahead would become when there was a pizza ad and an executive was walking down the street. He was handing out these little cute, nickel-sized pizzas to working people, just working the street. And then there's this rotund older fella, slightly balding, standing on the curbside, and he starts to hand one out and says, "None for you, Mr. Hedge Fund guy," and pulls back. Now, when we validated that speaking ill of a hedge fund helped you sell a $5 pizza, we knew we were in real problem. And that is, in fact, the case. Anybody who says anything ugly about a hedge fund generally goes up in value. In fact, I can put a personal spin on it. When I left Congress to go to the hedge fund industry, I am confident I am the only member of Congress who had his reputation go downhill. It's just, it's absolute. I told my mom I was leaving to go do this work, and I explained what a hedge fund was and my role and so forth. And she says, "What do I tell the family?" And so she's 85, and I thought maybe it was a little complex. And I went back and tried to redefine it, and she, "No, son, I got that part. I want to know what I can tell my friends." So it even started at home. But, and as in everything, facts eventually matter. You can ignore them for a while. But we began to figure out how can we do this outreach. And our first round of interaction went to the logical things to respond to the press characterizations, which we found unfair. The leverage question. There was a Financial Services Authority study, 5 years in duration, global in perspective, and found on average hedge fund leverage was on average between 2 and 3 to 1. There have been various university studies conducted. When we were able to finally sit down in front of a member who had expressed concern about these highly leveraged entities who were not properly regulated, we could go through these studies, hand them off, and say, these are not our numbers. They're not just governmental, they're not just U.S., they're not just academic. We have a wide array of them over different time periods that can assure you that the utilization of leverage is not as widespread nor as problematic as you might have heard. In fact, 24.3% of our industry at a given time did not deploy leverage at all. And that in itself would begin to shock people. Well, that's just not what I've heard. How can this be, And so we'd have to leave it. And then we'd actually get calls back, do you mind if I call X? I said, please do, and engage whoever you like. Then when you began to cast us in the net in relation to Fannie and Freddie, for example, to help give them parameters for contrast and comparison, I was pretty much I shall characterize myself as a strong reform advocate, maybe it would be a kind way to say it, in my days with regard to Fannie and Freddie over capital adequacy and a lot of other issues. And when they finally went to that great receivership in the sky, they were somewhere north of 80 to 1. And then you look at the investment banks that were 35 or 40 to 1, and then you look at traditional banks that are 15 to 25 to 1, and then you find hedge funds down here at somewhere at least under 5, but more than likely between 1 and 3. It didn't fit expectations. Well, we then began to slip from that into systemic relevance in the question of how can one institution become so important that if it were to go sideways, there would be adverse ramifications to taxpayers broadly. And we began to point out that many of our funds are on opposite sides of the same trade. We're geographically diverse. We're from a product perspective, very diverse, and from a management and investment strategy, there are all sorts of moving pieces. We're not monolithic in investing only in first mortgages. That began to erode it a bit. Then when we talked about the size of our entire industry relative to the insured depositories, we really began to shrink in significance. Then when we talk about, well, what happens with one of our guys goes down, there's no direct taxpayer linkage. Strange people show up and take furniture. End of story. And it's happened. And so outside the one outlier of LTCM, which conducted its affairs in an extraordinarily different manner from customary business practice today, you know, give me millions, don't call me for 3 years, and I'll get back to you. That's not a sustainable model today, and there is no hedge fund that is able to raise capital nor conduct its business enterprise in anything like an LTCM model today. And so we began to slowly change the understandings and perceptions about how the industry operated. But it really didn't make that much difference. There was a missing link here. The link was we were still New York in the minds of most members of Congress. And speaking with some degree of authority on the matter, if you've got somebody sitting in front of you who's not your constituent and who hadn't written a check and has no recourse against you if you happen to vote against their interests, becoming viewed in a parochial manner or a constituent-like setting is extremely important. And hence we began to develop a database, which we've just rolled out an iPhone app a couple of days ago, where you can punch the button for Louisiana and find out how much money is allocated by the LASERS, Louisiana State Employees Retirement System, to alternatives. And by becoming a connected financial conduit to state retirees, to university endowments, it's amazing the transformation that has in the mind of a policymaker, where I'm no longer that foreigner in New York who's manipulating things. I'm a guy working out of Baton Rouge who's helping pensioners who don't even know we're generating alpha for their retirement security. And that's begun to change the understandings about who we are and what we do. It's reflective of a broader change in our industry makeup as well, which I think, frankly, has been very helpful. And that is, as we have moved away from private wealth management in the first 20, 30 years of the existence of the industry, we're now primarily managers of institutional investors' resources. In fact, may be surprising to some that the board of MFA has gone through significant modifications over time. Not only do we have our stakeholders who are our business partners, our broker-dealers, our lawyers, our accountants, and representatives of all of the industries serving on our board, we now have 3 institutional investors who are members of our board. Cindo Olivares, who manages King Abdullah's endowment for his university. We have Ash Williams from the Florida State Plan and Peter Gilbert from Lehigh, who have been terrific additions in bringing fresh perspectives to board consideration. And so as the change from private wealth management over to institutional investor, and hanging my sleeve on your mic, we have become more institutional in our conduct. If there's a source I could turn you to that I found of interest, Deutsche Bank does an alternative investment survey, and in their 10th edition out this year, the report's very helpful, but there were questions concerning transparency that I found particularly enlightening. The first question of the investor community, and by the way, I should point out that the basis of the survey is 376 investor firms were given inquiry, representing about $1.35 trillion of investment dollars. So it's statistically significant. My press people told me to use that word in front of academics. That was supposed to make me look relevant. You know, I was relating. And so the point is that it's a meaningful piece of work done over several years. And the question was, what is most important to you as an investor to hear from the manager of your funds? Number one, we need to hear by a profit and loss attribution by subcategory. You want to know what's going on. You don't want to know at every deal level, but you want to be able to really get comfortable about what's going on. But number two on that list is we want to talk to the manager who's running my portfolio at least monthly. So communication. We want to pick up the phone. I want to get those set of numbers, and then I want to talk to you about it. Very reasonable. And there was a host of other questions, but what caught my eye was sort of a catch-all. And this one is really pretty big. And listen to the wording of the way this was asked. How happy are you with the level of transparency you receive from your manager? Now, if you flip back to political polling data, you'd never ask anybody how happy you were. My God, you'd get zero. What you say is, are you favorably inclined, lean favorable, kind of neutral, lean, unfavorable, or are you just outright unfavorable to this candidate? Well, as a candidate, I would certainly take all the favorables. Then I'd take all the lean favorables. Then I'm going to get 70% of the neutral guys, and my press release would say Baker has a 52.3% favorable rating by aggregating all those buckets. To ask somebody, are you happy, means they're comparing you in their mind against their objective theoretical standard that would satisfy their expectations. We hit 70% out of this survey. Now, I would even collect money to run for re-election if I'd had a 70% happy rating. So things have markedly changed. And I don't attribute this necessarily to the generosity of the industry in all cases. It is investor demand. But our managers understand that giving investors the information they need to make an informed decision is a good process. Now, I've gone through all of this to get us to this point of what are we doing on our side of the fence to help lay the platform for what I hope is a reasonable understanding about our members' construction of accounting and reporting methodologies to meet investor demands are not inexpensive, and they are often complex. And that is the underlayment for why our members and our industry is viewing regulatory transformation with a very careful eye. In our business, very small price movements dictate very large financial outcomes. And so when we hear discussion about, well, we just need to get this and we need to get that and we need it in this format, it has extraordinary monetary impact. And also the chronology for deployment of new standards of conduct. If Group A is asked to do it before B, C, and D, and it comes at a financial increment, then they're immediately at a disadvantage in the marketplace, which is very sophisticated and can find those mispricings of product very quickly. And so the role of the regulator in our world is extremely important. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I testified in front of Congress long before Dodd-Frank was introduced, contemplated, in favor of mandatory registration as a business model that our industry should support. That was a big change in the MFA's position on the matter. So we have a good, long, solid history of being supportive of regulatory oversight. But we have always coupled that with the statement that we would really like to have the most efficient system possible, because regulation does affect market outcomes. And it's against that platform that I initiate sort of, well, where are we kind of concerned with potential, where are we going at this moment? By our count, Dodd-Frank's not even a quarter done. Another third is somewhere in the regulatory process, and another third is yet to be proposed. This is going to be a long-term relationship. And so we do not want to be viewed as anything other than a reliable source of good information, and hopefully a conversation partner where we can discuss ideas about how we get the industry where you want it to be in order to be viewed as a responsible, contributing, reliable participant in the financial markets. And I'm going to go to my notepad here because I want to make sure I don't misspeak for a number of different reasons on these potential areas of improvement. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, we lovingly refer to as FSOC, has a mission to be the repository for and the distributor of data to all financial regulators on the Commission. It's not often emphasized, but there's also an "and" in that set of responsibilities. And I know how hard this is to accomplish, but at least I need to say it, is to coordinate, to try to help enhance communication so that when an agency has a goal in mind, that the goal is achieved in concert with other agencies who may have similar inquiry, but perhaps posting the question in a different manner or in asking for it to be reported in a slightly different way. So keep in mind, we've built a system now to be responsive to the investors, to gain their confidence and to have them feel comfortable we are giving them adequate information to make keen business decisions. We really don't want to have to build multiple reporting methodologies singular to each regulatory interest, but hope that somehow we can find a way to have a standard of disclosure that then is shared across all platforms, enabling regulators to have a level of comfort that they are understanding what needs to be supervised. With the CFTC decision to rescind the exemption on CPO registration, obviously that was of significance to us. We feel there would be great benefit from the long-standing effort to have the SEC, CFTC engaged in discussions about product oversight and in regulatory requirements, because now we have a duplicative standard for registration. Further, with the reporting dates now established for Form PF, we have issued a letter, and it's an ongoing process on our side, to ask for clarification about what does this term mean, or how do we calculate this element, to make sure that when we give you the data that you're asking for, that there's not variance in the calculations coming from the firm to the regulator, which could result in regulatory decisions or inquiries being made that are merely just based on the inconsistency of the standards being applied. And where we can minimize those issues, we think that would yield great benefits. With regard to the implementation of Title VII of Dodd-Frank, we've agreed with the CFTC approach. We're not pushing back on the direction, but let me give you a couple of specifics. We have concerns about self-execution or uncleared swap margin requirements, but there's a potential for disparities as some participants we understand may be forced to engage in higher margins than others in the same period of time. And so going back to my earlier observation about cost differentials, the competitiveness of the marketplace, and how these apparently inconsequential things from a regulatory view looking in, we would hope that we could have this train all leave with all the cars coupled to the same locomotive. We believe that clearing, centralized clearing, is a very valuable goal, but it should be the prerequisite for execution on CEFs and DCMs. as contemplated by Dodd-Frank. And in this one, we're hoping the CFTC would decouple from the CEF trading requirement from the clearing requirement. By trying to simultaneously engage in both goals, and we could always be misinformed, but we think it's a complex procedure, and that the consequences may well be to delay the implementation of clearing while trying to coordinate the larger project. So in that instance, we want to break them apart. We have recently written that we support ICE's Clear Credits portfolio margining petition to the SEC and CFTC, and I know this is a particularly tough one, but to maintain customer funds in a single omnibus account for cleared positions and single name credit default swaps, we think that cross-margining capabilities would provide significant, not inconsequential, efficiencies and gains to market participants that would make it a valuable goal. And I recognize for many reasons why this is difficult to achieve, but just kind of had to say it. MFA also has concerns that as we do our best, let's assume for the moment we got a perfect world, we now know what all the definitions mean, we're doing our best to get our systems up and running, and here comes this truckload of information from the alternative investment industry. We have extreme level of concern, there's no other way to characterize it, about protection of the confidentiality of that information. Now, any regulator in the room calls us, we're going to be there, 1:30 in the afternoon, and here it is. But we are trusting the value of our enterprise into the hands of government officials to ensure not only there's not public disclosure, but that our competitors don't get insight through the unwinding of these reports that takes away our advantage. We are nothing but an intellectual product. We don't have cans of Spam on the shelf that we go sell. It's all about work, taking that and utilizing and deploying it in a timely manner and yielding a consequence which we think generates alpha for a lot of people. And the potential consequence of having our privileged information released in an inappropriate manner is top tier of concerns that we have. And I hadn't even got to the EU. Let me tell you, what's going on there right now, I was listening with one ear to Mr. Bernanke this morning talking about the implications of our own year-end financial cliff coupled with the EU problems. We all have reason to be particularly concerned about our political leadership and international leadership coming to some rational conclusion in a reasonable period of time, if it's at all possible. But we're still in the mix. And despite the enhanced cost of regulatory compliance, despite the demands of investors for disclosure, which takes time and talent, we're doing our job. Allocations from pensions and endowments since 2008, the real crisis and test of every sector of the financial marketplace, have gone up. Not only have individual allocations within pensions increased, the number of pensions and endowments which are now engaged and viewing us not necessarily as only an alpha generation mechanism, but as a mechanism by which you can diversify and hedge against adverse outcomes. That's what I've had so much difficulty in explaining on the Hill, is how does this work? Even getting in discussions of what's a short sale and how do you make money off of that? It's finance 101, but it's so pivotal that folks who are making the life or death decisions about where an industry goes or can't go understand the fundamentals about what it is we do. And so we have an enormous road ahead of us. Now, keeping in mind the focus of the problem on the Hill, slide across the pond to the EU. They make the Congress look efficient. It is absolutely staggering how difficult it is, with a 2-year presidency, just about the time the poor person figures out what it is they're to do, they're out and some other guy's going to be coming on deck. 27 different finance ministers. We are unfortunately in the mode of opening offices in London, probably Brussels, next year out of absolute necessity. We're spending so much time on airplanes getting back and forth to explain ourselves, and the view by the French, Italians, particularly, and others of our industry is we would be given a merciful sentence if we were just shot. There's a prejudice toward our role in financial services management that is far beyond anything that has appeared in the debate in the U.S. And the last diagram I saw on their financial regulatory progress actually has a box with plans for 2018. Now, that in my world, that's a really, really long time that we're going to be engaged there. So coupling the EU uncertainty together with the more modest regulatory concerns here, together with the world economic unsettling circumstance, and looking what it might mean to the future of the industry. I look at the really significant industry leaders today. Had the great opportunity to visit with them individually and talk about the changes they've seen. And almost to a person, it started out with a guy thinking, I can do this. It was not quite as bad as, he had his buddy, his dog, and a six-pack in the garage. But, they started out really rather modestly and have enjoyed tremendous success. And that's why I'm really glad to be in the role I'm in today. I was always a really strong free market advocate within the Congress. And it's really kind of neat to be able to speak for an organization where your product is your intellect, your success is based on your reputation. It can go away overnight, and if you're successful, you enjoy great benefit. If you lose it all. There's no upside for us if our investors do poorly. We do well, they do well. We don't do so well, they don't do so well. And the flight of capital is just instantaneous. I have great admiration for people who still enter into the free market system just like the corner grocery store guy, and they make it or not on the level of service provided and the skill sets they deploy. And when they go away, it's a sad day for the family, but no taxpayer in America is going to be called on to sweep up the mess. That's my model for financial services going forward, and I'm proud to say the model for this industry. But I worry a bit that where we are today going forward and the ability of an individual who's equally driven, equally smart, who has a family willing to give him a few bucks, how in the world are you going to go down to your garage with your dog and start one of these businesses today? It's really a closing loophole, and it's a sad element of our progress. But I have to recognize that's one of the challenges I face in trying to figure out how do we keep this regulatory burden fairly balanced while recognizing that you have an obligation to defend the public interest. We want to be helpful. We want to be a good partner. We want to communicate at every opportunity. But this is going to be a tough job. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to ask if there's questions, but I also take answers. Yes. Yeah, yes, sir.
Kyle from the University of Maryland.
Yes, sir.
So made some comments about LTCM. So that was a prop trading desk that like Solomon Brothers set up a hedge fund, blew up. After that, I think a lot of those strategies went back into the investment banking industries, and then they blew up there. So you have Bear Stearns blew up, Lehman Brothers blew up, Merrill Lynch blew up. Now you've got Dodd-Frank Act and the Volcker Rule, which would appear to kick the prop trading desks out of the investment banks. Are they going to go back into the hedge fund industry? Are we going to have like a bunch of LTCMs back in the hedge fund industry?
I think the probability of an LTCM recurrence, first let me acknowledge that anything's possible. Any extreme. No LTCMs ever, one a week for the next 20 years. But more centered in the academic significant, statistically significant. I think given the transparency now demanded by investors, Anyone who says no on a material fact relating to investment practices is going to have a very, very difficult time raising capital in today's market. Now, the matter of a large bank deploying capital, you know, the J.P. Morgan question, was that a hedge or was it proprietary trading? I think that's going to continue to be a point of great debate within the Congress for some numbers of years to come. Now, if we later find that the losses at Morgan would necessitate any intervention, holy cow, I can only imagine the reaction that might occur. So if we have an adverse event that does call for taxpayer deployment, then I think all bets are off. As long as the failures are contained and manageable, which we certainly hope that's the case with the Morgan report, then I think there will likely be less and less focus. You know, these things are so cyclical. When I came to Congress in the 80s, we were just coming out of the S&L debacle, and, you know, everybody just wanted to burn their charters. Then it wasn't long after we went through the credit crunch in the Northeast because the lending criteria had been so cranked down. Then we opened the throttle back up and we got into the tech bubble. And so we're going to go through these vacillations. No regulatory system and no set of law can prevent someone from making a stupid decision or being greedy. And what we hope is the regulatory system can catch the excesses before they become significant to the taxpayer. That's the balancing goal. So whether it's a proprietary desk or a hedge fund, what we're hoping, and not necessarily in the span of Mr. Green's, in the view of Mr. Greenspan, in that context of letting market discipline work, I really believe in our case, investors are extremely keen, and we are dealing with professional fiduciaries, not retail investors. And despite the recent changes in the prohibition on our advertising, we have no desire to reach out to working families directly. Our role is to deal with that pension fiduciary and make sure that he's asking all the right questions and is our intermediary. We like that safety valve. So I think the likelihood is, the probabilities, those concerns are diminished, but we got to remain vigilant. Not everybody's a member of MFA. Not everybody agrees with our standards of best practice. There will always be people coming in and out of any business that are going to be at the edge. By the way, I hadn't said it directly, but that's why we like a regulatory framework that's consistent and understandable. We only do well in efficient markets. When markets are manipulated, that we don't do well because we trade in real values. And so there's a parallel goal here for the responsible members of our industry to have a regulatory system that actually works. Yes, sir.
Jim Angel from Georgetown. If you look at the money we've spent on the SEC and the CFTC since the beginning of their existence in current dollars, it's less than investors' losses from one Bernie Madoff. And yet the news comes out this week that the proposed budget for the CFTC has been cut to $25 billion below the current year. What is the MFA going to do to make sure that the regulators have enough resources to bring in enough experienced, knowledgeable people to avoid making stupid mistakes?
Sure. No, it's something we have internally discussed a lot. Chairman Baucus recently had a hearing on his own proposal to create an SRO for retail investment advisors. That, I presume, would be funded by an assessment by the SRO on whoever is subject to their regulation. That's not a model that our membership has found to be attractive, but we're not retail. We strongly support the OC's division being strengthened to give it the tools and resources necessary within the SEC. We believe that adding on and building up is a much sounder business model than creating out of whole cloth. I stop short of saying we support a fee of X, but we're going to work with the regulator, and hopefully, whatever the outcome of the budget discussions, that we get a regulatory capacity that is capable and competent and appropriately funded. Now, our members are fairly split over whether existing sources of revenue are sufficient for our purpose, but they don't have the broader view of all the SEC's obligations. And I'm sad to say, I think with the looming cliff, there's nothing that's going to be exempt from rather adverse and significant budget curtailment, and I can't speak to the current proposal that reduces CFTC, but I'm going to be shocked if any agency receives significant increases in the current environment, and I don't know how we get around the capacity question. The idea that advisors would only be visited by the SEC once every 10 or 11 years is not an acceptable rotation standard. So it has to be addressed. But fortunately for me, I don't have to vote yes or no. I can dodge. And so I can say we want efficient regulation. We understand it will cost something, but we'd like to see the model and understand what the related costs might be. Yes, sir.
Russ Warren with the University of Maryland. Can you talk a little bit about portfolio disclosure, detailed portfolio disclosure? Are there any circumstances under which the MFA would support or at least accept detailed portfolio disclosure by hedge funds?
We have, and I assume you mean public disclosure.
Yes.
Yeah, that's more of a difficult question than disclosure to the investor or regulators. Well, I'd come at it first with what public value would you use to say that would be advisable, and I don't think that I'm speaking inappropriately when I suggest that there are a lot of parroting trades that may become a significant adverse problem. Even nobody's maybe gotten into this one because it's always volatile, but I get it a lot, on the short sale side. Even more so problematic. We are for disclosing whatever the regulator wants in a format they want it, in a timely manner that makes them happy. Generally, with regard to public disclosure, not so much. But I won't say I'm closing the door. I say we need to understand why public disclosure would have a publicly beneficial outcome. I appreciate the opportunity to be visiting with you. I hope that each of you in your individual capacities will feel free to call on the MFA. Matter of fact, given the university presence, we have an institutional investor advisory council, which is made up of about 15 members across the country. We're growing it out. It's just a phone call quarterly today. Eventually, it will migrate into an in-person meeting annually, probably. But the idea is to engage in discussions that might help me better understand where the industry should be going. I take those recommendations back to our executive committee and the leadership of our association, and we have actually had initiatives generated and are in the process of being implemented as a result of those exchanges. And point out that we also have those 3 institutional investors now on our board who I'm sure would be delighted to take a question or comment from you when there would be a need to do so. But this is a beginning. This is opening the door. We hope you will find this helpful, and that as we go down this long road together, we'll communicate often. Thank you.